Welcome to Washington Talk. I'm Young-Kyo Kim. Washington didn't wait long before it sent to Seoul the new special representative for North Korea, Sung Kim, who stressed the trilateral cooperation among the U.S., South Korea, and Japan in dealing with Pyongyang. And North Korea flatly rejected the U.S. offer for dialogue, leaving many watchers wonder what their true intentions are. Today we'll discuss these and more. Joining me is Mr. Mark Tokola, Vice President of the Korea Economic Institute of America. Mr. Tokola had served as Deputy Chief of Mission at the U.S. Embassy in Seoul. Jenny Town also joins me today. Ms. Town is Senior Fellow at the Stimson Center and Director of the 38 North, a website providing North Korea analysis. Welcome to the program.
Great, thank you.
Thank you.
Let's start with Special Representative Sung Kim's visit to Seoul. He said the United States is willing to meet with North Korea anywhere, anytime, without preconditions. Ms. Tokola, what does he mean by without preconditions?
Well, I think Sung Kim, by using those words, was indicating that the Biden administration wants to pursue a diplomatic path with North Korea. And they're open to do it without creating any obstacles or barriers or tests for North Korea to have to pass in order to resume talks. Now, whether that's enough to convince North Korea to restart diplomacy, I'm not sure. But it does signal to the rest of the world, including China and Russia, that the obstacle to talks starting is not Washington, it's North Korea. So that might apply a little more pressure on North Korea to become more flexible in beginning to renegotiate.
Just follow up on that. Mr. Tokola, did you sense any change in Washington's stance from what Sung Kim said about this without preconditions?
Well, I think it fits in with what they've been saying earlier. You know, the Biden administration described their new North Korea policy as being one of flexibility and calibration and step-by-step. So I think what they're saying is they're prepared to actually start with North Korea whenever North Korea wants. I think Sung Kim just emphasized that point.
Ms. Tao, how did you take what Sung Kim said?
You know, they're trying to give the impression that, you know, they're open to diplomacy and they're willing to meet at any time. I don't think they expected the answer that they got from Pyongyang. I think there was a sense that North Korea would want to restart negotiations sooner rather than later, given the difficult domestic conditions it faces now. But that's simply not the case. And that's not what the North Koreans have been saying in recent months either, especially when the administration's talking points so far have only stressed the goal of denuclearization and nothing more, despite reaffirming the Singapore joint statement, which sets a much broader agenda. So while the U.S. has said that it's willing to meet, it hasn't really given a lot of indications of how this time around would be much different or what the North Koreans can expect to get out of this.
But saying, Sung Kim saying without preconditions, does that indicate that Washington has softened its stance towards North Korea?
I don't think it's softened its stance. It hasn't had preconditions since the Obama administration, to be honest. And so I think there's a lot of talking points here where, you know, there's just no indication, though, of really that we're negotiating. It's really much more gives off the impression that they want to talk and they want to talk about process and principles. And that was one of the complaints from the North Koreans before, is that they get to these meetings, they talk about process and principles, and they never really get to the heart of the matter, and they never come home with anything tangible to justify the actions that they've taken.
And the U.S. side clearly indicated it is looking forward to the positive response from Pyongyang. However, the immediate responses from Kim Yo-jong and Lee Sung-gun, the top diplomat, were not at all positive. Shall we take them at face value?
Well, I think both Kim Yo-jong and Lee Sung-gun's statements were meant to emphasize that while Kim Jong-un in his recent plenary session speech, he indicated that the door to diplomacy is still open. It doesn't mean that the North Koreans are going to run through it. Their responses didn't necessarily close the door either, but really conveyed the idea that there's no rush to get back into talks, especially without a better expectation of what talks would actually accomplish. And so after the last diplomatic push, which amounted to very little in terms of tangible benefits for North Korea, the North Koreans seem to be very reluctant to come back. They want a much more results-driven, results-oriented dialogue going forward.
Mr. Tokola, how did you take North Korea's response? Why are they responding like this?
I didn't see it as being that negative myself. When they talked about either confrontation or cooperation, I took it to mean they don't want to negotiate today. But I didn't see them closing the door on negotiations at all. I think they're saying that they're not prepared to talk right now. I think by North Korean rhetoric standards, their statements have been very mild about the U.S. recently.
Could you give me some examples about why you seeing the North Korea's response being mild?
Well, for example, they did not hold their traditional June 25th anti-American imperialism day events. So them not doing that, I think, was a signal that they're not trying to be harsh toward the United States right now. That's one example.
Right. North Korea said, Kim Yo-jong and Lee Sung-won said, it is not willing to come out to talks. And you said it seems like they're talking about not willing to come out to talks at this moment. Then what should U.S. can do more about this?
I think we shouldn't waste time. I think that even if North Korea is not prepared to talk immediately, there's a lot that can be done behind the scenes between Washington and Seoul with other countries to prepare negotiating positions that might lead to constructive dialogue when it begins. So talking about things beyond denuclearization, talking about bringing in other countries perhaps to help North Korea, talking about the agenda and the timing and the carrots. What might the U.S. offer in terms of sanctions relief? Which sanctions could be offered first, on what terms? There's a lot of preparation that could be done usefully.
In order to bring North Korea to the talks, do you think U.S. might lift some of the sanctions first?
I can't see the sanctions being lifted first because there's no special reason to. The reason negotiations work is because both sides want something, and then you trade. In Hanoi and Singapore, it's quite clear that North Korea wants a lifting of sanctions. So that's a negotiating piece of leverage. Sanctions should not be for the purpose of punishing or forcing. They should be negotiating leverage. So I think negotiating them away in advance by lifting sanctions before the talks begin might even be counterproductive in terms of being able to have constructive talks.
I'll turn to Ms. Town. Ms. Town, is there anything that U.S. can do more at this moment?
You know, the North Koreans don't seem to be ready to come to negotiations now. But the message, if you read it carefully, was very much, they're not willing to talk now when, again, they don't believe it will lead anywhere. So I think there's a lot that the U.S. could do to give the impression that there's something more tangible on the table. And, some of that is, modifying public messaging to address more than the denuclearization goal, to get back to that Singapore agenda that included a peace regime and normalizing relations. Be more agile about diplomacy as well. So instead of just offering working level talks without expectations, why not just float an initial proposal? If we're willing to do sort of incremental steps, what would a first step look like? And what would the U.S. like the first step to look like? So it gives them something to respond to. It builds that expectation. It's results driven, results oriented, and can bring them to the table on very concrete terms. And I do think they can, do some things, not necessarily lift sanctions, but do things that show that the relationship can actually evolve. And, that doesn't necessarily mean big things, but right-sizing some policies, such as lifting the travel ban on U.S. citizens going to North Korea, and clearing some of the obstacles away, especially in terms of OFAC licensing, for U.S. NGOs to offer humanitarian assistance. These would be, unilateral steps that honestly should have been taken after signing the Singapore joint statement in 2018. And so again, trying to right-size that policy to show that there's some evolution here and that different outcomes are possible.
Meanwhile, the Biden administration announced it is extending sanctions against North Korea for another year. Mr. Tokola, does this indicate that the U.S. will not ease sanctions in order to bring North Koreans to the table?
Well, I'm not sure about the premise of the idea that if we lifted sanctions, it would bring them to the table. I'm not sure that's necessarily the case. And there's lots we can do beyond sanctions lifting. The only reason to have sanctions is to use them for leverage to negotiate. And so I think we do need to think about how to lift them, in what order, at what time. But I think one thing that Biden administration is doing differently is saying that they are not trying to hold up complete verifiable nuclearization as being a first step before there's negotiation. President Biden, in his joint press conference with Moon Jae-in, I thought interestingly, said that our ultimate goal is denuclearization, which to me sounds like he's thinking of it as being at the end of the road rather than the beginning. The gradual, step-by-step, calibrated means the Biden people, I think, are prepared to talk to North Korea about step-by-step measures. Also, what South Korea has advocated.
Ms. Tao, how did you read the U.S. government maintaining sanctions while calling for dialogues with North Korea?
Yeah, there doesn't seem to be much appetite or any appetite really to do any unilateral moves ahead of negotiations. And I think there is an expectation from North Korea that the US should do something unilaterally, much like what North Korea did back in 2018 ahead of the Singapore summit. The problem with renewing this status is, in terms of how the North Koreans will perceive this, is the North Koreans have not been testing. They have not had the aggressive behavior that they did when this was first established. And so they'll look at it as an unreciprocal action. So something that the US is taken that just proves the hostile policy. So I think there's a lot to be said about the administration having some talking points that talk about a more calibrated, practical approach and having better expectations about pacing, more realistic expectations about pacing of negotiations themselves. But unfortunately, I think all the talking points and all the optics really point to a pretty standard U.S. approach to North Korea that's very similar to past administrations of, sanctions and pressure and sanctions and pressure.
And during Sung Kim's visit to Seoul, the South Korean government said the U.S. and South Korea agreed to consider the conclusion of the working group forum. North Korea has been decrying it as a hurdle to inter-Korean relations. However, the State Department said it is most certainly not ending, rather far from it. Ms. Tao, why the difference here?
Well, I don't think the working group came at a time when US and South Korea were not talking to each other enough. Where South Korea was way far out in advance, and the US was usually like reading about it in the news and trying to catch up. And so I think, the establishment of the working group originally was to try and bring some of that coordination back together. And unfortunately, it got the optic of South Korea asking permission from the US for moves on North Korea. And that, I think, is really how the North Koreans perceived it. I think that's how a lot of South Koreans perceived it as well. And so when South Korea wasn't able to move forward on certain things, it really gave this impression that the US was holding them back. So I think, it's not necessarily a bad thing for the mechanism as it was to disband if there is real cooperation, going forward, which we have seen at very different levels and very heightened levels than what we've seen during the past administration. The question now, though, is without that mechanism, how long would this cooperation last, especially if there isn't movement on the US DPRK front that would create avenues for inter-Korean cooperation to move forward?
Mm-hmm. Mr. Tokola, did the working group actually block the talks with North Korea, as they claim?
I don't think so. I think the essential point is that Washington and Seoul communicate every day. And one of the things they talk about most is cooperation with North Korea. So you don't need a working group to have that conversation going on. It went on before the working group, it went on after the working group. I think the reason that they announced the working group, as Jenny said, was to reassure the publics that there was cooperation going on, which was happening behind the scenes. But it backfired in terms of, I think, giving the impression that the U.S. was vetoing some South Korean gestures. I think so. It didn't achieve its purpose. But the idea that you don't need a working group to talk, and I think we will talk, and that cooperation will go forward. North Korea will light on any excuse to obstruct progress when they decide they are not going to have progress. So I don't think North Korea's complaints about the working group are any more valid than their complaints about tabletop exercises. It's just an excuse.
Mm-hmm. And South Korean President Moon Jae-in, he had an interview with Time, and he reaffirmed his commitment to improving relations with North Korea. He said Kim Jong-un was honest, enthusiastic, and determined. Ms. Tao, what did you make of what he said during the interview?
Well, I think it's obvious that President Moon is fully invested in reviving inter-Korean relations and remains optimistic against growing odds. I'm sure the conversations and interactions he had with Kim Jong-un at that time were positive, but it was a very different time, and it was when things still seemed possible. But the problem is they never panned out. And I think the more important question here is not what does Moon think of Kim, but what does Kim think of Moon? And does he think of him in that same light? And my sense is the answer would be no. Moon was overly positive and overly enthusiastic and committed to an agenda that required international cooperation to accomplish, but was never able to broker that cooperation. So if you're Kim, this creates a huge credibility gap for Moon that until he can deliver, Kim is not likely to want to deal with him, regardless of what he might think of him personally.
Mr. Tokola, will President Moon have one more shot as a mediator between the U.S. and North Korea?
I'm not fond of that word mediator or mediation. I think South Korea is far too important a country to be relegated to a mediating role. I think we need to have a good U.S.-North Korean diplomacy bilaterally, and there needs to be good inter-Korean dialogue too. They're both important. And Washington and Seoul need to coordinate on their approach toward North Korea to make sure it's most effective. But I would not relegate South Korea to a mediating role. They're too big for that. I think he's doing what he can do, which is to keep the door open. I appreciate President Moon's instincts to try to engage North Korea. That's absolutely correct. The question of how North Korea responds. I agree with Jenny that it's much more up to Pyongyang what to do with President Moon's initiatives than anything else South Korea can do. I think the problem now is that North Korea is too absorbed in its domestic economic crisis to engage in diplomacy. I think they're not just able to do it at this point because the government's not infinitely large in Pyongyang. I think they're very domestically focused. So we may have to wait until they get past this very bad period to be able to resume diplomacy.
I think there's a credibility gap right now for Moon Jae-in in his dealings with North Korea. I think he overpromised what he could deliver. I think he was overconfident in both his ability to sway Pyongyang and Washington. And so now, until Moon Jae-in is able to move forward on the inter-Korean agenda to bring forward one of the substantive commitments that they agreed to in Panmunjom and Pyongyang, I don't think there's much that Moon can do. Certainly, there's a role for him to play in terms of keeping pressure on Washington to make sure that North Korea doesn't drop in priority, and that it stays an active part of U.S. national security and foreign policy concern. But beyond that, there's very little, and there's very little space.
I think that one thing South Korea and the United States could both usefully do is to develop bipartisan approaches towards North Korea. I think Kim Jong-un believes that once Moon Jae-in passes and there's a new president, South Korean policy could change utterly. And I think he's concerned that when the Biden administration's term ends, U.S. policy might shift completely. So he has that uncertainty. If both South Korea and the United States could have a bipartisan consensus of some sort on North Korean diplomacy, it might reassure Kim Jong-un that he's going to be able to negotiate a sustainable agreement.
On the occasion of the 71st anniversary of the Korean War, the United States commemorates who answered the call to defend South Korea. And at the same time, there is a move to name a New York street after American college student Otto Warmbier, who died soon after being released from imprisonment in North Korea. It's been 4 years since his death, but it still serves as a reminder to the Americans of the human rights situation in North Korea. Mr. Tokola and Ms. Tao, thank you so much for your time today.
Great, thank you.
Thank you.
And that does it for this week's Washington Talk from Voice of America. Please join us again next week for more analysis.